Hello, everybody. My name is Ravi. I'm a software architect at one of the local companies in Nebraska. In this video, I want to talk about the difference between .NET Standard and .NET Core. So, .NET Core, as you guys know, is a platform that helps you build a variety of apps, like web applications, desktop applications, mobile applications, APIs, and whatnot, right? So we all know what ASP.NET Core is, right? That's a platform that helps us build web applications. As simple as that. What about .NET Standard? So .NET Standard is more like a specification. So .NET Standard helps you. It has a set of APIs that implement certain features, and that helps sharing the code base across various platforms. When I say platforms, the examples are Mono, for example, like Xamarin.iOS, Xamarin.android, ASP.NET Core, right? ASP.NET Framework, the older .NET Framework. So all of these are different platforms you can use to build a variety of applications. So all of these platforms implement .NET Standard. Like, for example, take Unity. It's a game development platform, right? So Unity has several editions as well, right? Like 2018, I think, is the last one. So that also supports a .NET Standard 2.0, I think. So the bottom line is um, all these platforms that help you build applications, they all implement .NET Standard, right? So that's like a common protocol that all of these applications will implement, right? So let's talk about a little bit of history for .NET Standard. So prior to .NET Standard, right, we have something called PCL, Portable Class Libraries. So PCL is the way Microsoft enabled code sharing, like whatever packages, whatever classes, whatever combined modules they're building, they want to share that across multiple platforms. Like, for example, Windows Phone, they want to share that across Windows Phone, and they want to share that across .NET Framework, or Xamarin. So they don't want to basically create everything from scratch. So what they do is they create a PCL, and that's called a base library, right? So for example, and then from that base, they create a profile of PCL. For example, let's say that um, there is some functionality or some set of library like APIs that are only specific to Windows Phone and .NET Framework. So that's a profile or a flavor of the base PCL, right? So all of this code base used to be in Core Effects. Like if you go to GitHub and if you look for Core Effects, that's where the .NET code is open source, right? That's where it's housed. But I think recently they moved it to Runtime, a folder called Runtime, .NET Runtime. So that's where the current active development of .NET Core is happening. So long story short, .NET Standard is a specification. It has a specific set of APIs that are common across all platforms. And they have versions. For example, .NET Standard has 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. I think the latest one is 2.1, right? So the latest LTS version of .NET is, I think, .NET Core 3.1, and that implements .NET Standard 2.1. Okay, so enough about what .NET Standard is. As I mentioned, it's a specification. Next up is what are you going to do with it? So, okay, so we learned about .NET Standard. What's the use case? The use case is when you're building a class library, right? That's when you want to target .NET Standard as opposed to .NET Core, right? If you're building an application, right? If you're building a web application or something like that, you don't want to use .NET Standard because nothing runs on .NET Standard. You can't run an app on .NET Standard. It doesn't have a runtime. So then you want to use .NET ASP.NET Core, right? So that's the moniker you want to use. But if you're building just a library, which can be used by other libraries or which can be used by an application that is targeting a certain platform that also implements .NET Standard, that's when you can use .NET Standard, right? And also by targeting your library to .NET Standard, you're increasing the adaptability, right? So that means your package is now available cross-platform, right? If somebody's building a Windows application or somebody's using Xamarin.iOS or something like that, they can use your library in those platforms as well. So you're not tailored to just ASP.NET or something like that. So that's the history of .NET Standard, and they all started with PCLs and the BCLs, the base class libraries. And now we're with .NET Standard. So with .NET Core, they released .NET Standard too. That's how they first started exposing .NET Standard. All right, next up, let's see what I have here. I think we covered a lot of this. So that's the main thing that I want to talk about. Next up is there's something called a compatibility shim. So compatibility shim is basically an adapter, kind of like an adapter. For example, let's say that you have a .NET Standard library. So you can reference other .NET Standard library as long as the version is equal or less, right? So a .NET Standard 1.2 can access a .NET Standard 1.2 or less, but you can't access a .NET Standard 1.4 or 2.0, right? So a compatibility shim is like, for example, when .NET Standard is first getting popular, there's a lot of NuGet packages out there that are not built with .NET Standard, right? They're built with .NET Framework. There has to be a way to connect your .NET Standard library to a .NET Framework library. So that's where the compatibility shim comes to the matter. So you have a .NET Framework library here, you have a .NET Standard library here. So as long as this is 4.6.1 or lower, you can use a shim to connect the .NET Framework and .NET Core, .NET Standard. So that's kind of how the shim helps, right? And one other thing that I want to mention is analyzers. There is a Roslyn analyzer, which is excellent. When you install that NuGet package, it can warn you at the time of build that, hey, you have a library out there that's not compatible from a cross-platform standpoint. So Roslyn analyzer is very useful. And also, for example, let's say that it's warning about a certain library and you look at it and you feel like, oh, it's perfectly fine. I will never use this outside the context of ASP.NET Core. So I don't need this warning. So as you know, in Visual Studio, if that's your editor of choice, you can suppress the warnings by directly going to the csproj file and adding an attribute to the package reference. It's called NU. I forgot the name of the attribute is no warn, and the value of the attribute is like NU some set of numbers, but that's primarily the idea. So you can suppress some of those warnings thrown by these Roslyn analyzers. Well, that's it about .NET Standard. .NET Standard, I think the current version is 2.1. The LTS means long-term support. The long-term support version of .NET Core also implements .NET Standard 2.1. All right, thank you.